Welcome to the first episode in Click Revisions and Inspector Calls season. These videos focus on a range of study topics, including the characters and themes that run through the play, its structure and the language used by the author J.B. Priestley, as well as the social and historical context in which the play was written and received by the public. This first video introduces the play's context, in other words, the social and historical circumstances in which Inspector Calls was written, and how its playwright J.B. Priestley was influenced by the society he lived in. We will look at some of the background on Priestley himself and examine what life was like for both men and women in 1912 when the play is set. We will define what social class is and look at how people of different social standing were viewed just before the First World War. We'll also examine different attitudes towards charity and social welfare, which is one of the most important themes of the play. Finally, we will also be looking at why Priestley chose to set his play in 1912 when it was written in 1945. An Inspector Calls is viewed as one of the most important plays of the 20th century. Indeed, the fact that it is still produced regularly by theatre companies all over the world shows how relevant Priestley's work still is over 70 years later. The play was written in 1945 at the end of World War II, but is set in 1912, shortly before the start of the First World War. Though it is a play by a British playwright, and very much about Britain, it was first performed in the Soviet Union or Russia and wasn't performed in the UK until a year later. J.B. Priestley was born in Yorkshire in 1894 and narrowly escaped death fighting in World War I. Upon returning from the war, he began writing, and went on to write letters, newspaper articles, over 50 plays, and much more. His work often sought to make a political statement about the state of society and the plight of the people in it. During the Second World War, he also hosted a weekly talk show which was axed for being critical of the current government, despite being very, very popular with the public. Priestley was viewed as a left-winger or a socialist, which means he was interested in equality and fairness for all people, not just those who could afford to support themselves. In 1942, 3 years before An Inspector Calls was first performed, Priestley helped some people start a new political party called the Commonwealth Party, which became part of the Labour Party in 1945, and he was also one of the founder members of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or the CND. Priestley believed that people should all take care of each other regardless of their background or differences. His goal was to point out how people from lower class backgrounds were given less opportunity in society than people from upper class families, and therefore found it more difficult to succeed. Ultimately, he wanted society to even out so that everyone got an equal share and a fair shot at success. So, just what is class, and how do we define what class a person falls into? To understand social class, it's only important to know the difference between 3 different types of people. These divisions are made based on the wealth and background of each individual, and we can draw a clear line from top to bottom, which makes it very simple. So, at the top we have the upper class. These are people born into money who are generally thought to have an easier life than those born without money, because they don't have to struggle, they live in some degree of luxury compared to the less well-off, and they have more power within the community because of their wealth. The upper class are also usually the most well-educated and are more likely to go to university and take up professional, well-paid jobs in later life. This sector of society is represented in the play by both Mrs. Burling and Gerald Croft, who are born into affluent or wealthy families. Below the upper class sits the middle class. These are self-made people, people who are born without great wealth, but who have a fair education and have managed to build themselves up enough to live comfortably among the upper class and do not have to struggle. In the play, this sector of society is represented by Arthur Burling, who mentions how he's a self-made man several times, and who is excited by his daughter's engagement to Gerald because it brings together 2 factory-owning families. Finally, at the bottom rung of the ladder, we have the working class or lower class. This sector encompasses the poorest and least educated people, those who work less skilled jobs, have to strive to pay bills, and who often struggle to make themselves part of the society created and controlled by the upper class. In this play, the character of Eva Smith represents the poorest, most unfortunate members of society, those who, in Priestley's view, don't stand a chance in a system that's stacked against them from the start. And J.B. Priestley uses her fate as a way of looking at the treatment of all lower-class people by the rich and powerful. There has always been a large gap in the quality of life between the upper and lower classes in society, and this is reflected in the play's setting, which we'll examine in greater detail later in this series. However, it should be clear from the outset of the play that the Burling family is very well off. Priestley supplies very detailed stage directions that describe the house the family lives in and the lavish celebration they're hosting to celebrate their daughter's engagement. This is a comfortable family who live in a house with separate dining room, study and lounge, who have a telephone which only the very richest in society had in 1912, and who drink their alcohol from a decanter and not from the bottle. This is a stark contrast to the conditions lived in by Eva Smith. The inspector describes her home as being little more than a dingy little back bedroom. Priestley uses this contrast to highlight just how easy the Burling family have it as privileged members of society, and this links to how much irresponsible power they exert on the people around them, particularly Eva Smith. It is no coincidence that we never see Eva Smith in the play. We don't actually see on-stage flashbacks for each character, and we only hear about her from the mouths of the other characters. This is because the upper and lower classes rarely directly mixed with one another, and one of Priestley's goals was to highlight how little the rich and powerful think about the people they consider beneath them in the social hierarchy. So, if the upper class are the lords and ladies, the lawmakers, the mayors, the respected members of society, then by comparison the lower class encompass the roles in society most frowned upon or least respected, from manual workers all the way down to criminals and prostitutes. In theory, the higher up the ladder you are, the more likely you are to look down on those beneath you and judge them. Of course, this is an extremely simplified way to look at it, but it helps to place the events of the play in the correct time and place. The first part of the 20th century saw a great deal of social change in Great Britain. After all, the two world wars that took place forced men and women from all backgrounds to support each other in a way they never had before, against a common enemy. However, this social change didn't happen overnight, and many members of the upper class fought hard against any attempts to offer charity to people they saw as the dregs of society. In fact, the issue of charity and goodwill is just as important to the context of Inspector Calls as it is as a central theme of the play. The Burling family are all in a position to be able to help the worst off in society, again represented here by Eva Smith, and choose to exert that power differently. As we will discuss later, each member of the family views its responsibility to help others, or not help them at all, in very different ways, and Priestley uses this to encourage debate among the audience about how these ideas relate to the world they live in. In studying An Inspector Calls, you'll probably have been asked to consider the question, which member of the Burling family is most to blame for the death of Eva Smith? And if you haven't, it's a very useful question to consider. It's important to remember that in answering this question, there is no incorrect answer. Only the opinions of each audience member based on their own beliefs and how they view the morality of each character. As long as you feel you can justify your opinions based on the events of the play, you will always give the right answer, which makes your job much easier. So, whether you feel Arthur Burling is to blame for firing Eva Smith from the factory, or that Eric and Gerald are most to blame for the way they exploited Eva Smith, or that Mrs. Burling is most responsible for casting a pregnant woman out at her time of greatest need, this says as much about your own beliefs as it does about the actions of the characters. And this is exactly what J.B. Priestley wanted to achieve. So, why did the writer set the play in 1912 when it was written in 1945? Well, firstly, Priestley was using the events preceding the First World War to allow his characters to predict the future. There are many mentions in the play of the possibility of war, though as we will see in later videos, each character views the threat very differently, with some characters seeing war as a certainty and others more doubtful that it will happen. Of course, the First World War did take place, only 2 years after when the play is set, and by looking at the events of the play from the future, audience members are able to judge whether the forward-looking views of these characters were right or wrong in the context of what actually happened. This isn't the only way Priestley uses real-life events to contextualize the play's narrative either. Burling mentions the unsinkable new ship Titanic, which launched in April of 1912, the same month the play is set. He also mentions the factory strikes of 1910, which were a real-world event that altered many attitudes towards factory work and sparked a fierce public debate. However, there were many events that took place between 1912 and the end of the Second World War, which all resulted in a huge amount of change. And as we'll see in a later video, Mr. Burling fails to correctly predict the outcome of any of them. So, beginning in 1912, we have the launch of the Titanic, which was thought at the time to be a glorious monument to mankind's progress and achievement, but ultimately ended up looking like one of mankind's biggest acts of hubris or arrogance. Then in 1914, we have the beginning of the First World War, which lasted until 1918, and altered the roles of both men and women in British society forever. Then in 1917 came the Russian Revolution, which saw the collapse of the Russian Empire and a new communist government in the Soviet Union. This is particularly important because it links strongly to J.B. Priestley's own political beliefs as a socialist, which in turn are very strongly intertwined into the narrative of An Inspector Calls. Next, in 1926, came the general strike in the UK, where over 1.7 million workers went on strike for 9 days in support of Britain's coal miners. Again, this is important, as it's an event hinted at by both the miners' strike of 1912, which is mentioned in the play, and the striking workers at Burlington Company who were fired from their jobs for being seen as troublemakers. 3 years later, in 1929, came the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression that followed it, which resulted in a financial crisis that caused a ripple effect across the entire world for years to come. Then finally, in 1939, we have the Second World War, which once again forced men to fight overseas and altered gender roles in the UK, and also saw the first atomic bombs being used in warfare in August 1945, something which J.B. Priestley was completely against as a founder member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND. So, between 1912 and 1945, a lot of British life, which was assumed to be fixed and safe, was actually changed forever. This is most evident in the role of women in British society, as this period in history saw women begin to move towards some level of equality with men. This happened for a number of reasons. Firstly, the rise of women's movements, such as the suffragettes, highlighted the vast gap between men and women in terms of pay and power. After all, women wouldn't be allowed to vote in elections in Great Britain until 1918. Furthermore, the two world wars that took place between 1912 and 1945 created a huge shift in gender politics simply because so many men were conscripted into the army and sent overseas to fight and often die in battle. Many roles, usually occupied by men, from factory workers to postmen and milkmen, were taken by women while the men were away at war, cementing the role of women as more vital to society running smoothly, and resulting in increased equality when the war finished, as many women were reluctant to go back to their previous, often home-based mother and housewife roles. Before this period, women were nearly always seen as subservient or less important to society than men, particularly in poorer families where the women were forced into childcare and housekeeping roles. It was not uncommon for women to have all their decisions made for them by men, and this is reflected several times in the play, particularly in Sheila's response to her engagement ring. "Oh, Gerald, it's the one you wanted me to have." So, overall, that's a lot of information to take in, and a lot of knowledge to have in order to really understand the background of the play. However, beyond all the dates and the names and the events, the most important thing for you to remember is that the first half of the 20th century saw a huge amount of social, economic and political change in Great Britain, and An Inspector Calls is set almost the exact moment before that change began. Thanks for watching. Up next in episode 2 of Click Revision series on An Inspector Calls, we're going to begin to look at each of the characters, beginning with Arthur Burling. Now you've watched this video, try to write a few sentences or even a long paragraph answering each of these questions. When you re-watch the video, you can continue to add and develop your response until you're satisfied you have plenty to say on the subject if it comes up in your English literature exam. Question 1. What is social class, and how do we define the different classes in society? Question 2. How did the role of women in society change during the first half of the 20th century? Question 3. Why did J.B. Priestley set An Inspector Calls in 1912?